The Torah portion this week is Tezave, and Tezave continues on with the creation of the Mishkan, which was begun in last week's Parsha. We're going to have a break next week in terms of the narrative in the Torah, in terms of the sin of the golden calf, and then we're going to go back to actually the building of the Mishkan and the Jewish people starting to occupy it. So that's what we have in store for ourselves for the balance of the book of Exodus. And this week's Parsha Tezave works as follows. It has basically three parts, as I understand it. Number one is the commandment to set aside an oil. And unlike normally, the oil wasn't pressed because they didn't have olives to gather, but rather the oil was oil that was taken with them out of Egypt, and it was determined to have a sufficient level of purity or refined by Moshe in order to be used in the Mishkan. Unlike once they come to the land of Israel, where there's very specific instructions in terms of how to produce the oil, and we're a little familiar with that from the Hanukkah story, where we know that it took them 8 days to be able to begin producing pure oil for the then Beit HaMikdash, for the temple in Jerusalem. And that's when the Hanukkah miracle took place to fill that gap. The next section has to do with the clothing and the vestments of the Kohen and the Kohen Gadol. And it's really, I don't have a color picture to show you, but the garments of the Kohen Gadol were bright and colorful and woven and involved a golden plate across his forehead. The garments of the regular Kohanim were very simple and white. And then it concludes, surprisingly, with the instructions to make the Mizbeach HaZahav, it has different names, the incense offering Mizbeach altar, which was placed inside the Holy of Holies. And we're going to get to later in the class to the reason why they appear out of order in this regard. But I first wanted to reach back to a discussion we had at the end of last week. Last week we were talking about magnanimity and the opportunity to give and to give freely and to really appreciate the joy of giving and the privilege of giving and the opportunity to give. It brought us into a discussion based on a quote there from the rabbis, which was the idea, are you really giving for yourself so that you could be rewarded in the future? Or are you in fact giving to do good to others? And it wasn't so crystal clear, but the way I saw it was a continuum of a person through giving to others, becoming a bigger, more empathetic, sensitive person, growing as a human being and growing in closeness to God, because you're doing so to be similar to God. And as this grows within the heart of the person becomes a truly giving person, where the focus is completely on helping the receiver rather than accruing merit to yourself. That's the outline of what we discussed. I wanted to dig in here now. We're talking about building a Mishkan, a house for God amongst the Jewish people. Okay, that's how we started off. The screen split. I'm not going to keep it split for too much longer, but they shall make, the second source here, they shall make a holy place, a mikdash for me, so that I may dwell among them, within them. The Hebrew has nuances of meaning in both directions. So the idea is there that the endeavor of the Jewish people is to create a situation where God is in intimate, close proximity with the entire Jewish people. So what I wanted to think about for a minute is, if we were tasked with doing this, if in concept, if our job was to build a house for God, would we think about that house being a humble abode, a magnificent abode? And I really would like you to think about that and to offer an opinion. Conceiving of a house for God, of God, a sanctuary that would be amongst the Jewish people. What is our concern, our primary concern in terms of figuring out how to construct it? What do we tell the architects? What do we tell people? Please, if anyone wants to offer a viewpoint here, I would really appreciate it. Okay.
Well, Rabbi, it seems to me that the design principles for the Mishkan were very different than the design principles for the first temple. For the Mishkan, basically it was following God's directions. He was a designer and engineer for the Mishkan and didn't leave much room for creative design on the part of the Jewish people. The temple, seems to me, was just the opposite, where there were no clear directions or instructions from God, and it was very much up to those who created it.
Okay, so let me clarify a little bit. I think I could understand where you'd get that impression from, especially when you look at the remains we have of the second temple, which was vastly expanded upon by Herod. You know, the last 100 years before it was destroyed, he expanded the dimensions and the scope of the temple and made it much more beautiful from the outside. But the fact is that the dimensions for the Mishkan and the Beit HaMikdash are the same. In other words, the size of the Holy of Holies, the size of the holy area, the size of the inner courtyard, the size of the outer courtyard, those dimensions are all called out by the Torah specifically. A difference is that the Mishkan was portable, so it could be taken down and put up, whereas the Beit HaMikdash was built permanently in one place. And also the plaza or the area around the Beit HaMikdash is not determined. And hence the outer walls at times expanded, at times contracted. Herod had a massive building project, like I say, about 100 years before the destruction of the temple, where he brought in an immense amount of labor and he built retaining walls, one of which is the Kotel HaMa'aravi, the western wall we have today. And he filled in immense amounts of dirt to take what was until then a fairly shaped mountain and instead to create a vast plaza with stairs on the end. So in that regard, it's malleable and changeable, but in terms of its essence, in terms of the temple itself, it's really called out by the Torah.
Rabbi, I admit I'm not that familiar with the design and construction of the first temple, but aside from the dimensions, was it called out in the Torah what materials would be used and what designs would be used with those materials?
So good question. So, okay, and the permanent walls were not called out, it's true, and they replaced the complicated system of poles and upright beams and everything else that we see there that's intricately described in the Mishkan. But the fact is that all the implements from the Mishkan itself were brought into the temple. So the ark was the same ark, the menorah was the same menorah, going back to Moshe's time, the altars were the same altars. Everything was called out and actually carried over. And you should know the Mishkan lasted for a period, and I don't know exactly, but pretty close to the same amount of time as the first temple did, because it was hundreds of years in Shiloh, in the city of Shiloh in Israel, that they just continued to do the service in the Mishkan, and the Jewish people went there because they didn't conquer Jerusalem until the time of King David, which was a much later period in time. So, I mean, I'd have to do a little more digging, but I'm pretty sure that what I'm saying is accurate. But what I wanted to think about in concept is the following idea. And I'll tell you where I'm coming from. In Europe, it was legally mandated that churches had to be the biggest buildings, the tallest buildings in towns, and they had to dominate the town. And hence the experience of millions of Jews and hundreds of years of Jewish experience in Christian Europe was living literally in the shadow of a church. And if you see descriptions of the influence of the church, And I'm not even talking during the Middle Ages, even during the period of the Renaissance, that the Pope owned art and owned music, and things were patrons of the arts. Everything significant was owned by the church. And in a certain sense, wisdom was the possession of the church. There was not a big idea that everyone should read and write in Europe, or whether that was a good idea or not. They weren't in a rush that everybody should have the Bible accessible to them. That was the scholar's role as the priests in the church. So what I want us to think about is there was an effort on the part of building these houses of God, and that's what they were meant to be, to make human beings feel very small, and to make the church or the institution of the church and even the physical buildings very, very big. And that's what I'm saying people literally, Christians, non-Christians, Jews, whoever was in these cities, the sun rose in the morning, and depending on where your house was positioned near the church, it didn't set on the horizon. It set by falling behind the edifice of the church, or it rose for you when it passed high enough in the sky so that the shadows of the church left your home. So there was literally a presence around you. Now, the reason I'm mentioning that is not to be any critic of churches or Catholicism, but for us to think about the idea that such a notion of reducing the individual and magnifying the authority of the institutions of religion is not the way Judaism works. And I'll give you a second example, which is very cogent to me. If you ever have the chance to visit Colonial Williamsburg, and they have a governor's mansion, and I've mentioned this over the years, very impressive to me. The governor's mansion is a large building, a couple of stories tall. When you walk in, there's an entry area, very sort of guarded. And then if you had an audience with the governor, and understand the governor was appointed by the King of England, who was thousands of miles away across the ocean. So this governor was really in place of the king or queen, as the case may be. You walked up a long stairway. And amazingly, this stairway was lined on the wall with weapons. A whole row of sabers, a row of swords, pistols, rifles, every kind of armament that you could do. So that if you had a 10 o'clock appointment to speak to the governor of the colony of Virginia, you arrived on time, you signed in, you were vetted, and you walked up the staircase, and before you ever got to see him, you were convinced of one particular fact. He has the guns. So I may have a gun at home, I'll be a hunter, I need to defend my house, I may live out in the countryside a little bit, I may have concerns about Indians, wildlife, other things going on in my life. But by the time I reached the governor's front door of his office to meet with him, I was convinced that the governor was in possession of might and power, and that I was subject to the rulership of the king that this governor represented. Okay, and these are givens. And that's why we have constitutional issues of the right to bear arms, because that was all pushback. Most of the Bill of Rights was a pushback against the way the colonists and the early Americans saw themselves subjugated by a king who was not accountable to them at all. Such things as not being able to quarter soldiers in a person's home, the right to bear arms, all these were pushbacks. And there was an armory, which meant a place where rifles and weapons were stored, and that armory was guarded all the time, and that armory was under the control of the governor representing the king. And hence, when you wanted to rebel, one of the things you did is you attacked the armory so that you could gain control of weapons and armaments, so that you could stand a chance to fight for your freedom or to throw off this subjectness. Now, that's that background. When I've seen depictions of the inner dimensions of the Mishkan and the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, what's most surprising to me is that if you went into the area of the holy area, the ceilings were 20 amos high. people were about 3 amos high. So if you do the math, in other words, it was like walking into a room with a 50-foot ceiling. And as a matter of fact, the room was rather narrow. And some of the commentaries really discuss how the room could stand up, especially on a temporary basis if wind was blowing and things like that, because it wouldn't have the structural integrity necessary to be such a tall, thin building. But that's the way it was. So for those Kohanim who walked inside the holy area, they were really dwarfed by the dimensions of the room. The menorah itself, the Kohen had to go up steps and reach up to fill the menorah and light it each day. The Mizbeach, the inner altar of incense, which was described in the end of this week's Torah reading, is not very high. And the shulchan, the table, which held the bread that was baked every Friday and placed into it, also I get the impression was not particularly high. But the massive sense of the room dwarfed the people inside, which makes me wonder right away, was it meant to be church-like in the sense of minimizing the scope of a person, or was it meant to maximize the scope of a person? So this is what I would like to discuss. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, what is your impression about Judaism? You know, we have fear of God, you know, trembling, standing before God on Yom Kippur. We know that our fate is in God's hands. How does this work in terms of us seeing ourselves within the world vis-a-vis God? And the other reference I would make is there's something we discussed at a small gathering of Headmaster Society people, and that is this, that a very famous Nobel-winning physicist put forward an idea. He said, religion can't be true, because if all God cared about were the moral choices I make as an individual, it is ridiculous for God to have created so vast a universe. And this was spoken by a Jewish man who, from the time he was a very young boy, was intrigued by the vastness of creation and looking into telescopes and contemplating, calculating the distance between stars and all these magnificent insights into creation that we have built upon year by year, decade by decade, you know, throughout the development of science. But along the way of being excited by this, Feynman became convinced that telling me that controlling my anger and speaking nicely to other people was nonsense, because as he put it, if that's what God was interested in, that he built too large of a stage for the actors to play in. So this is the way I wanted to think through the nature of the Mishkan. And I wanted to do so using an unusual source here. And I'm not here to ruffle anybody's feathers. And I'm really, I think that one of the bigger issues I face in life these days is trying to put forward questions and think about things without offending anybody. And I'm not sure that that's still possible, but I'm certainly not here to offend anybody listening to this. A quote, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, and I couldn't pin down this quote exactly. It's in Shochar Tov 37a, wherever that's to be found, and I'm not sure. I thought it was echoed in a sentence in Proverbs, but I haven't found that. But this is a legitimate quote. The Holy One, blessed be he, said, be jealous for my sake, for God's sake. Why? Were it not for envy, the world would not stand. A man would not plant a vineyard, marry a wife, or build a house. Okay, end of quote. What's the connection between this understanding of envy and what we're talking about here? Well, it includes building a house. And I think we know now that, what do they call them? Mega mansions, the idea of people getting a lot of notoriety because they're building homes of 40,000 square feet, 50,000 square feet. There are TV shows dedicated to that. People love seeing a drone fly over an estate, and the idea it has 8 acres and whatever it has, 55,000 square feet of home. And people like going to Hearst Castle and seeing how, how they schlepped up, bricks and wood and everything else they needed to build this magnificent, beautiful, well-designed playhouse so that people could come and feel entertained and feel that they're living on top of the world. So what I want to point out here is this. When the Torah says here that a person would not plant a vineyard, marry a wife, or build a house, were it not for envy, and it's indicating that there's room for envy for God's sake. I want to suggest something here without, I don't want anybody to feel that I'm looking up on Zillow how big your house is right now and determining how envious of a person you might be. What I want you to understand is this. We human beings bring an immense array of motivations to everything that we do. And it's a mixture of wanting a nice, secure place to live with my family and raise my children. And it feels good maybe if somebody says, wow, you have a beautiful home. And it also is provoked a little bit by the idea of feeling as though, well, how does my home measure up in comparison to homes around me? Even though the Torah says you shall not covet the house of your neighbor, the prohibition in the Torah. So what is this matter talking about? But it's talking about the nature of human beings is to be competitive, and it's to seek to create places that are associated with me, which offer some aggrandizement, show me some edge over other people, something that I could boast about. And what this source is even saying is you could even boast about it for God's sake. I could say, look, Baruch Hashem, thank God I live in a nice, comfortable home with ample bedrooms. I can invite guests to my home. I can have a beautiful Shabbos table. I can have silverware. I can have candelabras. I can do things on an uplifted level. And we understand that depending on the sincerity of the person and the motivation of the person, this can be a tremendously holy pursuit, and it can sanctify the world and uplift everyone. Or it could be an ego trip, or it could be a relentless pursuit to outdo the Joneses, not just to keep up with them, but to stay ahead of them. Or it could be some kind of a mixture of all of these things. So, and this source here goes through very interesting and hard to pin down examples. But I'll give you one of them, which I'm not sure makes it so much clearer to me, but it gives us a for example that at a certain point, Abraham made a calculation. This is in this Medrash. Abraham made a calculation that if God, in the midst of the flood, saw Noah and his 3 sons and their wives on this ark, and God may have thought to himself, well, is it really worth keeping these people alive? Are they really good enough to sustain the world? So what Avram calculated was that, yeah, because what were they doing? They were feeding these animals, they were keeping them alive, they were devoting themselves to preserving the world that God had originally created so it could be restarted. So Abraham thought to himself, wow, that's a tremendous merit that they had. And certainly that would convince God through the turmoil and chaos of the flood that these people deserve to be preserved and that they would be able to rebuild the world that would be worthwhile for God to sustain. So Avram made a calculation for himself and said, well, if that was the case, look at the opportunity I have today in my time, in my life, not worrying about a flood, but if I want to build the world, sustain the world, if I want to really, and you can put it 2 ways, find favor for myself, or you could say, please God by making God's world more fulfilling of what its original intentions probably were. So Avram decided, I'm going to devote myself to kindness. I'm going to put out for people. I'm going to feed them. When I see them in need, I'm going to try to help them. I'm not out to rearrange God's world. There'll be richer people. There'll be poorer people. There'll be people interested in connecting with me and speaking to me. And there'll be people that won't be interested. But at least I'm going to do my part to devote myself for the betterment of mankind because I'm envious, and this is the words they use, of the merit that Noah and his family accrued while they were on the ark. And I want something similar for myself. So you see how this medrash has fiber to it and threads to it of taking simple envy, which is I'm gonna break into your house in the middle of the night and steal your watch because I love it so much, and because Amazon's out of them right now, which is a violation of the 10 Commandments, as compared to me motivating myself and feeling as though, wow, if Noah was able to, under these adverse conditions, find the merit to sustain his family and have the wherewithal to rebuild the world, I'm going to, out of envy, and there's such a thing as good envy, motivating envy to do me pure good things, I'm going to do my best to sustain the world that I'm living in, and I'm going to work hard day and night. It's going to become, ultimately, it's going to become who I really am as a person. And that's what this medrash is about. So this brings us back to this task, build a house for God. So I want to say on one hand, this house should be a humble place, because God is not looking to reduce the magnitude of people. As I understand, God's interest in Kedusha is to spur us and encourage us to live holy lives, to be animated, to be driven towards making God's presence as manifest in the world as possible. And to do that, people have to feel as though I'm important. I have a role to play. I have something significant to contribute to the world. And therefore, this is leading me in the direction of wanting us to consider the following idea. Whatever grandeur there is in the temple and in the Mishkan, and please God, should any of us have the opportunity, and please God, we would, to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash and to create a house, a presence of God in our midst. And to whatever extent we do that in our lives now, during Shabbat, during family gatherings, through inviting people into our home for good, important purposes, to encourage philanthropy and to encourage them to be more kind to others, to make them more empathetic than others, whatever we're doing here, what we're really seeking to do is to create a place where the person feels as though I've created this to connect with you, but not to marginalize you and not to make you feel small and unimportant. You hear what I'm saying? So this is the thought process I was going through. So like Maimonides, I'm going to have two quotes from Maimonides here. Maimonides, early on, it's one of the early commandments that he emphasizes in his book of the Yad HaChazaka, delineating the whole Torah. Says in Yesodei HaTorah, in the Foundations of Torah, chapter 5, sentence 1, the entire house of Israel, look at it together. The entire house of Israel is commanded concerning the sanctification of his great name, as it is written, and I shall be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. Now, you could read this from the perspective of sanctifying God means to make God very big and make me very little and unimportant. Because after all, the word sanctification is to set something aside, to have reverence for it. I think we all agree to that. Or you could say the sanctification comes through my connection with God, my comfort level of being with God, and God almost saying, I'm going to build a beautiful home next to you. And you know why I want it to be so beautiful? Because I want you to come and visit me often. And I want you to feel as though, wow, this neighbor of mine built this place grandly and beautifully and in a holy way for this specific purpose of me feeling I want to go visit with him again. I want to connect with him. I want to spend more time in his home. And not because, wow, I want to see what his latest gadget is so I can buy one for my own house, or I want to figure out the dimensions of his living room so that when my architect comes and proposes a design for my house, I'm going to make sure that my living room is twice as the size of his. But rather, wow, what is the genius of creating a home where people love coming and feel comfortable enough within that home to really connect to God through prayer, because after all, the Beit HaMikdash and the Mishkan is a house of prayer. And you can only pray when you have a focus on God is interested in me, and God wants me to be here, and God is wanting me to pour out my heart to him. And this is the ideal setting to make me comfortable and convinced that that's a great thing for me to do. And that's really what the essence of prayer becomes. 3 times a year, the Jewish people run up to Jerusalem. They bring first fruits sometimes, they bring offerings, they come to hear the king read from the Torah after a Shemitah year. They come to see the great leaders of the Jewish people meeting in the Sanhedrin. They come for a number of reasons, but the essence of it is like they're coming to God's home because it's a place that I really want to be at. And I wanted to draw on our own feelings that we feel about going to the Kotel in Israel. If people felt as though, oh gosh, the Kotel, that's where the Beit HaMikdash was. That's where you could palpably see God there. I don't want to go there. It's too heavy for me. I feel too trepidatious afterwards. I feel too uncomfortable with myself. And which might be the way that it's certainly the way the governor of Virginia wanted citizens to feel when they walked down those steps in the governor's mansion and went back home. And they might say to their friends, I came with this idea that we would get more representation and that the king would lower the taxes. But oh my goodness, when I left, I'm just shaking in my boots. I'm scared to death the governor is going to come after me and it'll be all over. And I want to tie this together just briefly now, if there is what to tie together, because I think there is if you look at the end of Parshat Tezave, the Torah portion that we're going to read this Shabbat, and the final section, which is on page 482 in the Stone Chumash, 482, 483, and there's a little picture of it. And if you have the opportunity to get the new issue, the new one, you can really see a picture of it in a multicolored picture in the back of what the incense altar looked like and what its dimensions were and everything else. It's if you have one of these new ones, you'll see it in the back there. I can't find it right now. The big question is this. Here's the sequence of the Torah here. The Torah started off telling us we're going to build a Mishkan. You're going to build an ark. You're going to build a menorah. You're going to build a shulchan, a table. Then it's going to tell us about making the oil. Then it's going to tell us about the clothing of the Kohen. And now finally in chapter 30, it throws in the idea of you're going to make a mizbeach, an incense altar. It has different names, mizbeach hazahav, mizbeach hapanimi, mizbeach haketores. And that's also going to be placed in the holies. Now this question is, why do you separate them out like that? Why wasn't it listed in the right place? And the Ramban, and it's quoted here in the Stone Chumash, answers profoundly at the end. Because the purpose of this altar in creating a sweet, fragrant aroma was to assuage any sense of discomfort that God may have with us. And I would suggest reciprocally to make us feel more comfortable when we came to the Beit HaMikdash. And indeed, the Midrashim say that you could smell this incense, which was burned inside the closed area of the holy area of the temple from miles away. So what does that mean? It means as you approach the Beit HaMikdash, and you may have been thinking to yourself, wow, I'm walking into God's house, is my tie on straight, is my suit clean, are my shoes polished, all the kind of things we might think about if we were meeting some important person. And, and then what if I'm rejected? What if I've done something wrong? What if, the people guarding the leader are going to arrest me because of some flaw that I have? To allay all that, and in the final description of all the steps it takes to create a Mishkan, the Torah goes out of its way to finally describe the incense altar, because the incense altar is to facilitate a comfortable, warm, at-home connection, so to speak, between us and God, to help us feel as though, yes, God has built a temple here, but God didn't build it for God's ego. God didn't build it to make us feel small. God built it to create a tent of meeting, a place where we can commune with God, and a place that is most conducive for us to be able to pray, pour out our heart, share our burdens with God, feel a tremendous sense of satisfaction that we have the opportunity, and the whole world does, it's a house of prayer for everyone. We have the opportunity to get one-on-one time with God within God's home. And that's the way it's designed. That's the way it's fabricated. That's why the incense altar is described at the end. And that's what it's all about. So that don't misunderstand the gold and the dimensions and the holiness of it as being meant to repel us or to reduce us. Understand it in its proper way to make us feel, wow, look at the opportunity God has given us in order to facilitate a connection. And I'm going to read something from you. It comes from the commentary of the Meshech Chochmah, a rabbi of Dvinsk who died somewhere around 1920, 22. And it's on the famous book of Becoming Holy. He says like this, and I almost feel like he's talking to Feynman as well. This is a quote from it. God is infinite. He requires no perfection beyond his own. But because of his abundant kindness, he created a universe with countless lofty spheres, all of which recount his glory and comprehend the exaltedness of the creator of everything. Within this vast universe, God created a small, crude, insignificant speck in proportion to the cosmos, and that's planet Earth. And upon planet Earth, God created thousands of species, all kinds of creatures. And then he created one, about 3 cubits tall, an untamed ruffian with no inherent knowledge or comprehension of his maker, of God. Man is filled with contradictions, with righteousness, with evil and good, with corruption, with foolishness, with wisdom, with beauty, with ugliness, with laziness and energy. In many ways, this little being on this little speck of a planet is a miniature universe in and of itself, in and of himself. And once you realize the potential of this creation to connect with the creator, then you begin to see it in proportion to everything else that was created. It's really a magnificent thought process on the part of Mayor Simcha of Dvinsk. I think it should inform, first and foremost, as we've talked about tonight, our understanding of the temple and of the Mishkan that was built. It should inform our understanding in general of our own importance in the holiness of the world and in being God's partner in creating good. And it should also give us a sense of yearning for what the rebuilding of the temple, for a return to Jerusalem, for an opportunity to once again feel the grounding of knowing that such a place is there to welcome us, to boost us, to help us to find the guidance, to fulfill, to make all of creation and all of its grandeur worthwhile in God's eyes. And I wanted to share this as an understanding of the Mishkan. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Okay, as they say in the court, barring any objections,
Yeah, so I'll make a comment.
please.
So I think what you're saying is actually that the Mishkan is more than just a prayer hall, I guess, and that it is something integral to the Jewish people and sort of reflects how we should act and behave and feel towards each other, but also towards God.
But it should be a home base for us within all of creation. And again, I have great respect for Feynman, the Nobel laureate, but I just want to say, in other words, had he had a concept that, yes, the universe is vast and it's challenging and you can spend generations and generations just exploring one aspect of God's creation, this gives you a base to see yourself within that picture, and to see yourself within that picture in a meaningful, moral way. And to an extent, not having this place and this base and this frame of reference and like this compass setting point for how big or how small, how significant or how insignificant my life is vis-a-vis everything else, we're somewhat lost. And when we yearn for it to be rebuilt, it's not so that we can walk it down the street afterward and say, wow, that menorah, wow, what a work of art, what gold, how much is it worth, how overwhelming is its beauty, but rather a sense of, look how nicely God is lighting up the world for you and me so that we can have a clear vision of what's important. And I don't think we think about going to the Kotel. I don't think we think about connecting with the destruction of the temple. And I don't think we think about the universe around us in these terms often enough or clearly enough. And I think if we did, we would find a lot more energy to pursue and achieve goodness and fulfill our jobs in the world. And that's what this whole section of the Torah is aiming to build. Building in a way that God can dwell within us. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, everyone should have a great evening. I thank you very much for being here, and hopefully we'll share more ideas next week. Have a good night.
Thank you.
You too. Good night.
Bye.